Right. That's very cool. To those of y'all who are joining us online, really appreciate you doing that. The host for the program, the Triangle Foundation, has provided donuts and coffee, and they're really good. You're missing out. Next time, try to join us in person. But we're happy that you're joining us virtually. So we have a cause. Cause is, if you look at North Carolina's exports are huge. Right, 2022, it was our number one export. $4.7 billion in pharmaceutical exports, primarily to Canada, China, and the Netherlands. However, equally impressive is the amount of pharmaceutical products coming into North Carolina, $9.3 billion. So we have a $4.6 billion trade deficit in pharmaceuticals with the rest of the world. That's why we're here. We're going to try to bridge that gap. We want your North Carolina products looking at Japan and eventually entering the Japanese market. So it's my privilege. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. The goal to this endeavor is for this to be not so much a series of presentations, but a dialogue. And so we'd appreciate your questions along the way as well. I'll do this in reverse order. Paula Brown Stafford, currently the CEO of Allucent, has more than 35 years of biotech industry experience, including growing IQVIA, Quintiles, CRO services, serving as president, CEO, and chairman of Novan Inc., an adjunct professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and the recipient of so many awards and accolades that we would run out of time, including, but not limited to, her 2022 Triangle Business Journal's Lifetime Achievement Award for Women in Business. Paula, thank you for joining us.
Wasn't expecting that.
You said hello, come on.
Okay.
I apologize. Gizmo.
There are no clinical trials going on here. Next, Chubachi-san, thank you for joining us. Tomoko Maeda Chubachi is a physician drug developer, has worked in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years. He worked in Japan and the United States and led many global drug developments. Tomoko is currently advising several startups and small companies, both in the United States and Japan, helping them to develop clinical and regulatory strategies, including maximization of approvability in major regions. She also supports university spinoffs in Japan to initiate clinical trials in the United States. So Chubachi-san, thank you for joining us as well. And last but not least, who's going to lead us off, and I appreciate you coming all the way over from Japan to join us, Hiroshi Yamabe. Yamabe-san is the founder and CEO of Swaniel Inc., a consulting firm based in Japan. He specializes in services such as out-licensing, PMDA, you'll learn what that is, consultation, NHI price consultation, and commercial analyses aimed at addressing the issue of drug loss in Japan. Mr. Yamabe has 30 years of experience, primarily in sales and marketing at both multinational corporations and Japanese companies within the pharmaceutical industry across Japan, the United States, and Taiwan. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today, and I will let Yamabe-san. Thank you for being here.
Here.
Just
Yep. Okay, so thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and also thank you for EDPNC for inviting me to this conference. I'm Hiro Yamabe. I'm a founder and CEO of Swaniel Japan. So today, my talk is about solving drug loss and lag in Japan. I think I'm going to take you through what is drug loss. And then I think by the end of the presentation today, together with Tomoko and Paula, I think you will learn what is drug loss and how we can solve this issue, and why this is so important for you. Because the drug loss, in summary, is that the situation where the products approved in the US doesn't come to Japan market. No development activities for the drugs which has been already approved in. So that means that drug doesn't come to Japanese patients. So this is called drug loss. This issue is getting more important, and this is more serious now. So we're taking a lot of actions to solve this issue. If we solve this issue, I think this is going to be, I would say, triple win situation. Win-win-win situation. Win for Japanese patients for sure. They can access more easily to the new products approved in the US. Another win is win for the American companies. To maximize your asset, value of your asset, of course, it's better to go to Japan and generate some cash from Japan market. Another win is the industry in Japan. If we don't develop and commercialize the assets in the US, we don't generate the sales. So this is going to be a win-win-win situation. I think that's the main goal of my talk today. So before going into my talk, I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. As David mentioned, my background is before I founded this company, beginning of last year, I spent all of my careers in pharmaceutical industries. I started my career in Japan and I moved to the US. Actually, I went to Duke for MBA program. I'm a class of 2002. After graduating Duke, I started working in the US. Pharmacy, Pfizer, Schering-Plough, global marketing. After I went back to Japan, I was head of the prescription business in Gaodeon, Japan, chief commercial officer Ferring Japan, and a country manager Ferring Taiwan. And also worked for Japanese companies for the Meiji Seika Pharma as the head of international operations. So I'm a licensed pharmacist in Japan, but my main expertise is sales and marketing. So this is the outline of my talk today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan market overview, just the introduction. And then what is drug loss and lag, and why is this happening? And how does this information benefit North Carolina companies now? And more importantly, how does our company help you? This is the outline. So overview of Japan market. This is the global pharmaceutical sales. As you know, the biggest country in the market is US, and followed by China, and Japan is the third biggest market, representing 5% of the global market. In terms of the health expenditure as a share of GDP, Japan is ranked as number 4, followed by the US, Germany, and France, and Japan. Number 4 in the expenditure. So I'm going to show you 2 slides about the price, because the price is very critical for Japan and also European countries. And compared to the big 3 European countries, such as UK, Germany, France, the average price of Japan, drug price in Japan, is a little bit higher, even higher than the prices in European countries. So in price-wise, we are not so bad, almost comparable to the Europeans. And this is something you usually do not know, but this is also very, very critical and very attractive question for Japan. That is, in a price-controlled market like Japan, European countries, typical process is like this. Once you get approval, drug approval, you still need to apply for price reimbursement. And it takes a while until you get the price listed. So this shows how many months it takes to get price listed after you apply for your price reimbursement. If you look at the bottom half of the European countries, such as Spain, Italy, Belgium, France, as you see, it takes almost 1 year or even longer than 1 year. When I worked in Taiwan, I would say between 1 year and 1.5 years after we get approval. So still a long way to launch the products even after we get NDA approval. This is countries with reimbursement price. Look at this, Japan. In general, our authority gives us approval within 3 months after we make an application. The average days is only 64 days. This is really, really good, especially after I worked in Taiwan, I really understood the value of this. In Taiwan, NDA is not a final goal. But then next step, okay, 1 year, 1.5 years, when do we need to prepare for the commercial teams, right? It really depends on the price. But we cannot really make an early investment to prepare for commercialization because of the price. But in Japan, not really, only 64 days.
What question, do you want questions at the end or can we interrupt?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So in terms of setting the price, those negotiations only begin after approval, or is there any work during the review to proactively start to negotiate with the authorities on the pricing in Japan?
I know the situation only for Japan and Taiwan. In Taiwan, negotiation starts only after we make an application. But in Japan, even before we make an application, we start communicating. That's why we can make it within 3 months. That's a good question. So we need to prepare in advance, even before we get approval. Okay, so what is drug loss and lag? Because you're going to repeatedly hear the words today, even after my talk. I really wanted to ensure that you understand. If you look at this chart at the top of my slide, for the products approved in other countries first, like a US. For those approved in the US first, some segments, some products also approved in Japan, approved in US and Japan. Some products not approved in Japan. For the products approved in the US but are not in Japan, there's 2 groups. One, products where some development activities are going on. US approved, clinical studies phase 3 in Japan. That is, sorry, maybe you don't see my pointer, but that is a drug lag because we know that that drug is coming to Japanese market after US. Just the issue of delay. That's drug lag. The drug loss is a situation where products are approved in the US, but nothing is happening in Japan. No development activities whatsoever. So that if we don't take any actions, this product is not going to be approved in Japan. Nobody is working on this in Japan. That is going to be a future drug loss. That's called a drug loss. If you just Google or Wikipedia, drug lag is a simple delay in the approval of new drugs. And drug loss, like I mentioned, no development activities altogether. That's drug loss and lag.
これきついな、こんなんで聞いてんだったら。やってないねよって。
Oh, Korean. So next, why is this happening? I show you some analysis about this issue. A lot of studies have been done, especially in Japan. So if you see the numbers at the line of Japan, 143 products not approved in 2022. What do you mean by this is that for those 143 drugs are approved either in US or Europe. They are approved in other countries, but are not approved in Japan. 143. Out of 143, if you look at the numbers on the left-hand side, 57 are under development. Something is going on. So 57 products is going to be a drug loss. And 86, no development, is going to be a drug loss. If you go deeper, out of the 86, if you see the chart at the bottom side, 56% of the products, 48 products, are originated by EBP. This word is also, we repeatedly mention this word. EBP means emerging biopharma. In this analysis, you see the note at the bottom. The definition is that the companies founded within the last 30 years. And also the sales is less than $500 million per year. Pretty small and young company, but not too young, not too small, right? $500 million is still big, but in this definition, EVP is like this. So we know EVP origin is one of the key factors leading to drug loss. Other factors, orphan disease drugs and pediatrics. Why orphan disease drugs in Japan? We know country also aware that our issue is that the timing of giving orphan disease designation is pretty late compared to US and Europe. But PMDA, MHLW already aware that we're working on this issue. But pediatric issue, similar to US and Europe, but you know the size of the market for pediatric indication is relatively small. So that we really need to give some incentives to pharmaceutical companies for this segment. So I know EU and Europe, EU and US are doing pretty good jobs giving incentives to pharmaceutical companies. So Japan is also thinking something for this. So this is this chart. How we read is if you see the bottom left, you see a year in analysis. For example, 2014. This is a year of analysis. 188, the light blue bar. This is the number of products approved either in US or EU. In the year of 2000, between 2010 and 2014, so like recent 5 years, as of 2014. So out of this, 123 products are not approved in Japan. So in other words, 65% of the products approved in the US, EU at the time are not approved in Japan. So the ratio is 65%. That percentage, if you look at the dotted line, that percentage recently increasing. This is also a critical situation for Japan. So we really need to take some actions to move down.
Sensei, sorry to interrupt. Before going any further, so to be approved in Japan, do you have to go through some kind of development in Japan? Referring back to 2 slides ago, you are categorizing not approved into development or no development. But is there a pathway without any development in Japan to get approved in Japan?
For pharmaceutical products in general, no.
Okay.
I will touch on that too.
Okay, thank you.
So, question, sorry. Does it have to be developed in Japan, or if it needs to go into clinical trials, it needs to be tested and released in Japan?
Yeah, I will touch on that later.
Okay, yeah.
A little complicated, depending on the case.
So actually a question, if you can advance back to your slides. So the next one. So we're going to be talking about, how the situation's about to improve. But are there any generalities about, say, in 2014, what was the reason? Is it a language barrier? Is it a regulatory hurdle? Is it lack of interest? What contributed to only 65%?
Even at the time, I think attractiveness for the US company is not good enough. That's why pricing, and also what we hear a lot in the past was the regulatory pathway is very unclear. So I think, but PMDA spends a lot of time to clarify the pathway. And also to your questions, I think the length of the time to get approval since application relatively longer, maybe maybe earlier years, but the PMDA expanded the organization, hiring more people, and, you know, I think they made a lot of progress. Yeah, however, other issues are coming up as a EVP. Because I tell you, you know, this is also the question you may have in the later slides, so that, in the past, at the earlier days, let's say early beginning of 2000, big, development players, main development players are big farmers, like Pfizer, Schering-Plough, I used to work for. These companies are the main players to develop new products. But nowadays, a lot of EVP are the main players. And they don't have enough resources in Japan. You know, Pfizer has big affiliate in Japan. They have a lot of people, a lot of capabilities and resources. Whereas EVP, usually no affiliate, and a small team, small number of the people in the team. So funding issues. So that is also contributing to. Now, even Pfizer, you know, also tends to rely on the acquisition or partnership with EVP, depending on the stage of the assets they acquire. If they acquire an earlier stage, no problem. Later stage, they'll have issue. Yeah, I'm going to touch on this. So a little bit about EVP, right? So EVP is playing a very critical role now. So this analysis, the comparison between EVP and bigger pharma, development status in Japan among US approved drugs, but that are not approved in Japan. So for the, if you look at, analyze the products on the market in the US, but not in the, you know, not in Japan. But for the products originated by EVP, if you look at the bar chart on the top, if you look at the 31% blue color represent the number of products which where development is going on. So I'm not approved in Japan, development is going on. It's going to be drug lag, right? And the number of products, 71. So 71 products originated by biopharma, 31% will be drug lag, and black plus gray going to be a drug loss. So about 70% drug loss candidates, EVP. Look at pharma. Still, black and blue exist, not zero, but you know, because the EVP is not the only reason. Some attractiveness, clarification, market attractiveness, etc., is also contributing this. So, but clearly the percentage is very different between EVP and bigger pharma. This is another way to look. This shows a months in lag for the products approved in Japan. So if you look at the orange and light orange, orange one, brown one, represents the products which require additional studies in Japan after EU, US approval. Light brown, no additional study in Japan needed after US, EU approval. So also two categories, one for the products, Japanese developers acquire the assets through M&A partnerships. Let's say, I think EVP in North Carolina license out the assets to Japanese pharma, right? For Japanese pharma, they're going to be an applicant, and they acquired the products through M&A or partner. Or Pfizer Japan, small company. So we can read the two messages here. Compared to the products, dark brown versus light brown. Clearly, the months in lag is higher or bigger for the dark brown. That means if you had to run the additional clinical studies after US, EU approval, it really makes sense. It takes longer time to get to the market. Average is like, almost 4 or 5 years. So you lose basically 4 or 5 years to get the cash. And another message you can read here is between own company versus M&A partnership. Because you can calculate, let's say, weighted average of the monthly lag for M&A partnership. So probably weighted average months in lag for M&A segment is about like 40 months. Versus own company weighted average probably like 15. Because it will also really makes sense. The company who have affiliates in Japan, easy to get involved in Japan into any development strategy. So in that way, we can really reduce the time in monthly lag. So another factor is whether to involve Japan into the clinical studies is a key factor to solve drug. Among 60 new products approved in the US, what products involve Japan with clinical studies? So out of the 60 new products approved in the US, and left-hand side, 19 products also approved in Japan, right? 19 products approved both in the US and Japan. But out of 19, 15 involve Japan into the clinical study. So if you plan ahead and involve Japan into your clinical studies, national, multinational clinical studies, including Japan, we can tend to avoid the situation of drug loss. If you look at the right-hand side, not approved in Japan, 35 out of the 41 didn't involve Japan. If you leave it alone, okay, let's wish that somebody will buy in the future. If we do like this, situation is going to be worse. This is really causing drug loss.
A question about that, and I don't know, Tomoko, maybe you'll touch on it later, but are there any, I guess, best practices or kind of guidelines of what, if you are doing multinational studies and including Japanese patients, what proportion of the patients need to be from Japan in that trial to sort of meet any PMDA expectations, or is that something you'll touch on later, or?
Yeah, it's case by cases, but I will touch on that.
Okay.
Thank you. Question? Okay, in summary, why is drug loss happening? Simple story. Of course, there's many other factors, but for factors related to EBP. EBP is playing an important role in drug development today compared to 20 years ago. EBP tends not to include Japan into the drug development plan because of the resource, capabilities, funding issues. So that additional clinical studies in Japan after US approval may require additional investment, more investment. That influences Japanese companies' decision whether they want to buy or not, right? Because if you don't include Japan into the clinical studies, Japanese companies need to develop the rest of the studies. Sometimes they say phase 2 and 3 altogether, only for Japanese populations, which requires, let's say, $50 million US. Instead, if you include Japan into your clinical studies, Japan requires only certain portion of the total patients. Not necessarily all the patients should be Japanese. So that investment required only for Japan is much smaller than the case where you have to run clinical studies only for. So this is the cause of the why drug loss is happening. So I'm going to touch on a few more slides. So why this is so important for you? Because Japan is taking a lot of good action to solve this issue. The patient access issue is very, very serious for Japan. We cannot tolerate this situation. So MHLW Ministry of Health and also PMDA, like US FDA in Japan, like FDA in Japan. They are held expert meetings to discuss comprehensive strategies for solving drug loss in lag issues in 2022 and 3, involving panels from industry, government. They're working on very, everything is published, so you can see the progress of this meeting. One of the biggest deliverables so far, I think, is this phase 1 study omission. In the past, in general, PMDA requires the phase 1 study with Japanese population. But if US companies just thinking to go to phase 2 studies, and they're thinking to involve Japan, but Japan requires a phase 1 study, but you cannot go back anymore. Okay, let's forget Japan and then move on. We can solve that issue because now the PMDA is saying that we don't need phase 1 with Japanese population. I think this is going to be a big step. And Tomoko is going to highlight this in the next talk. And also the statement in parentheses, English version of the notification was issued on the same day. I think this is also going to be, maybe this is really normal for you, but for us, this is a really big thing. They prepared English notification at the same time. This implies how serious they are. And the last, PMDA Washington office. We're going to have a message from PMDA officer today, but they are setting up Washington satellite office in Washington, DC to facilitate regulatory consultations for especially EB, emerging biopharma in the US. Last, so this is a very important session for me. How does my company Swaneo help you in this situation? Our business goal, really two things. One, left-hand side, we help you to find development and also commercialization partners in Japan. If you just don't have enough resource to go outside of the US or Europe, we can take care and talk to potential buyers, potential companies to acquire your assets or collaborate with you in terms of development and commercialization in Japan. That's what we do. Number two, for decision support for including Japan into your development plans. What we mean by this is that for the key decision is like this. You have to answer this question. How do we include Japan into our development plan? We don't have enough resources. Let's focus on US and Europe. We really wanted to avoid this situation. If that's the case, we help you to do 3 potential projects. One, development strategy consultation. So on behalf of your client company, we can lead the PMDA consultations and recommend the development strategy with, we show you the estimated development cost. If you add Japan into your study, what are the extra costs based on the PMDA consultations? And number two, price consultation. Price is always very complicated. Even I have a price expert consultant, but I cannot sometimes understand what the price is going to be. So that we work and lead the consultation with MHOW. So we get the estimated price at the earlier stage, so that it's easier for you to make a decision. And then third, commercial assessment. So with these 3, you have information of how much is going to cost to do the studies in Japan or adding Japan into the clinical studies, and what will be the forecast, sales forecast, what are the demands, price. If you get those information, you can decide, for example, okay, include Japan into my clinical studies in phase 2, and then look for partners, right? Or we have to look for partner now, or decision like this can be made on in a good rationale. This is something I wanted to help to solve this. My last slide. So if you wanted to know more information about the services we can provide, please reach out to me at my email address, hiroshi.yamabe@swaneo.com. Or easier way to get connected with me is through LinkedIn. Just simply send me an invite and we can start communicating. Thank you.
I think we should go straight to Tomoko's presentation.
PMDA's.
PMDM with the PMDA
Yeah.
video,
Right,
because I think some of the puzzle pieces of the presentations are gonna
right.
are gonna frame the questions, I think. That's all right.
So we do the Tomoko's instead of the.
No, the PMDA, yeah. No. Audio.
Be a sneak peek, everybody.
Right.
You are getting, this is hot off the presses.
Right, so I asked PMDA officer and if we, they could provide us that some introduction video. So they worked hard and then the guy will introduce himself and introduce that what they are going to do in the Washington DC office. Thank you.
This slide provide a link to the PMDA website, which present regulatory information that will support when you plan your development in Japan. Japan is said to have the world's third largest market for pharmaceuticals. Good morning. I'm Akihiro Ishiguro, PMDA Japan. November 1st, I will be appointed as a head of PMDA Washington DC office. Since 2004, when PMDA was established, I have had a chance to contribute to Japanese regulations, including post-marketing drug safety, new drug review, review management, and regulatory science research promotion. I am excited to have this opportunity to utilize my experiences so far to the role as the head of the Washington DC office. I am honored to address you all here today at a Japan Biotech panel attended by stakeholders from the Research Triangle, one of the leading clusters of life science organizations in the United States. I would like to thank Dr. Chubachi.
We are feeding the computer.
Dr. Chubachi for giving me this opportunity today at the time of my appointed as the head of the PMDA Washington DC office. One of the main goals of the PMDA 5th midterm plan through March 2029 is to enhance its international collaboration and strengthen its capability for regulatory proposals. 2024 became the first year for the PMDA to establish the international hubs. As shown on this slide, PMDA Asia office started its operation in Bangkok, Thailand in July, and PMDA Washington DC office will be established in the central area of Washington DC in November. PMDA Washington DC office will be responsible for activities to strengthen cooperation in the United States. First, the office will provide timely information on Japanese regulation in English. Secondly, the office will play a coordinating role in strengthening regulatory collaboration and information exchange with administrative organizations in the United States, such as US FDA. Free charge consultation will be offered to US startup companies to provide useful information for their development in Japan. General consultation at a Washington DC office are scheduled to begin in the first quarter of 2025. No Japanese language materials or explanation will be required for the consultation with the Washington DC office. MHLW and PMDA continue to improve pharmaceutical regulations to encourage development and regulatory application in Japan from overseas. One example of a major improvement is a notification from MHLW published late last year to clarify the criteria for determining the need to conduct a Japanese phase 1 study to evaluate safety when planning a multi-regional clinical trial in the late phase in Japan. PMDA looks forward to further communication with stakeholders to make these new regulations recently launched more practical. This slide provides a link to the PMDA website, which presents regulatory information that will support when you plan your development in Japan. Japan is said to have the world's third largest market for pharmaceuticals and the second largest market for medical devices. The high transparency of timeline, both of the regulatory review process and drug price listing, makes it easy to predict the timing of regulatory approval and its drug price listing for national health insurance in Japan. The drug prices are uniform in Japan, so there is no need to coordinate with multiple suppliers. I hope that this PMDA website will help you discover the benefit of developing in Japan. This website will continue to be enhanced. The PMDA Washington DC office will serve to disseminate the characteristics of Japanese regulations. Please also visit PMDA Washington DC office when consultation service begins early next year. Online consultation are also welcome. Our office would like to support startup companies to choose to develop in Japan. We look forward to meeting with you all in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's great. Mr. Ishiguro sent me that slides to me 2 days ago. He is actually flying over to the US yesterday or today.
Wow.
So he will, get into the DC November 1st and then get settled in and hoping to open the office January 1st, early next. Okay. So now I will have some slides and to explain my experience in the actual global drug development and working in a small pharma with Polar and Cali here. So I will talk about new initiative from PMDA and its impact on US startups. So here's my career journey. I didn't put that the year, but I started my work in Pfizer 2002. So I'm a physician drug developer. I'm a dermatologist. So I did my residency in Japan and I did my postdoctoral fellowship in Boston. Then I went back to Japan and did the dermatology clinical practice. Then I went to Canada and did another fellowship in Canada. Then I came back to Japan and worked in Pfizer, Japan. So that was a very interesting time. It was 2002. So the 2002, I was actually engaged in the first Japan involvement for the global drug development. So I will talk about later too, but prior to 2002 or around that time, Japan required a standalone study for phase 1, 2, 3. That has been changing, and then 2002, Japan was incorporated in the global drug development. So that was the first time. I was very fortunate to work on that one of the first the drug development like that. Then after 5 years, I worked in Japan. I came to the United States, and then I worked in, I was the global clinical lead for the overall drug development process. So I was in Pfizer and Eli Lilly, and I came to GSK in 2014. So since then, I have been in North Carolina. After the GSK decided to move from, transfer their headquarters from here to Philadelphia, I came to Northern and fortunate to work with Paula and Carrie here. Then, after we got the approval early this year, that for molluscum treatment for children, I started my consulting business. So I'm helping several pharmaceutical companies and startups. They're both in Japan and in US. That's what I'm doing. So I will use my experience to explain what's going on right now in Japan. So I got this slide from PMDA. It's a little busier than what he presented, that I will present it. But you can see that the PMDA's website. I like PMDA's logo. That's cute. And I sometimes in the panda. And the PMDA website, you can see that English version. I don't say that really cover full scope of their business, but you can still see the English version from that website. And the PMDA work is very similar to FDA, so that they are concerned about the safety and also the adverse events of the safety, and then the assessment of the drug application for Japanese citizens. And they have several new initiatives for the Sakigake, which means that the forerunner, the what they call the accelerate review for the some drugs, and that of their deliverable here in the first approval in Japan, they're sometimes earlier than the US. So that happened here. And this is a very similar slide, but I can again highlight the Japanese phase 1 trial is not necessarily required prior to start the late phase multinational studies. So, and the startup companies in the US come to Washington, DC and comes out, and their package is very early time of the development. Right. So here's my slide. In 1990s, so the large pharma was obviously the players like Pfizer or GSK or Lilly, where I worked. So they had their global trials already going on, and then eventually emerging biopharma came to players. So maybe around 2005-ish, the emerging pharma became the very important players in the innovation. So then, the large pharma started the outsourcing for the monitoring. So I think the Paula really well aware of what's going on there. So the outsourcing came from the monitoring for the clinical and non-clinical. So that's where the CRO, contract research organization, or the clinical research organization plays a very important role. So there are many CROs in North Carolina, they are growing. But when the biotech emerging biopharma, in the EDP, biotech, university, spin-off, and startups, they came to the important role for the innovations. That's around 2010. So those are very limited resources. They don't have the full house, the workforce for the development. So the CRO came in to the very integrated role to help those biotech and emerging biopharma. So that's the service provider, and these days, and there's the Fujifilm and here too, and the manufacturing, and also outsourced. And then and another one is also the Salesforce too. The Salesforce is also outsourced. The industry landscape changed quite a bit for these 30 years. Again, so the globalization happened with big pharma, but these days that the innovation came from the emerging biopharma, they could not really globalize yet. That's the timeline I'm showing on the top. And here's the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 that the clinical trial stages. In the old days, they said that the standalone study will be required. Then around 2000, the global drug development came in, and the Japanese study started as a bridging. Often the Japanese patients were incorporated in the bridging, incorporated in the phase 3 study, but still, the Japanese phase 1 study was required, and those findings studied with Japanese are required. Eventually, the pharmaceutical company put a lot of pressure to the PMDA, so we negotiated through the pharma, and if Japanese patients are incorporated into phase 2 or phase 3, usually both studies, that's the big pharma actually did and still doing these days. But still, that the Japanese phase 1 study is required. Now that in 2002, as you saw that as you heard from that video, the standalone Japanese study may not be required. That's the change happening. So you can see this slide on the top. But in the bottom, they're here already. Hiro mentioned that the causing the last and lag and loss. That's happening in mostly from the emerging biopharma EDP. So EDP often has the alliance partner. The alliance partner tend to conduct phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, like standalone study here in the old days. So if the asset or if the asset is acquired by the Japanese company, you have to set the stage to discuss how conduct the clinical trial together. And if the only if that the leading discussion is only done between PMDA and other department in Japan, they may start from the standalone study. But if you incorporate the together with your company, your development can be accelerated. So the PMDA consultation in DC at early stage is very beneficial. How you work with PMDA and how to find, Hiro can also help to find the Japanese partner as well. All right, so And this is the very new, and part of the, self, information, but the rare diseases, you may not really need Japanese patient for PMDA submission. So you may not really necessary to conduct the Japan, the studies in Japan at all. But it's always a little sticky points, but there, depending on the disease, how that the Japanese environment affects the disease, they still may require a small Japanese patient study, but and here the ethnic differences, environmental differences, but basically what they say is that for rare diseases, you may not be necessary to conduct a Japanese study. So that's the part of this. So I wanted to summarize what I said today is that there, the points to consider for your future studies. The clinical trial design, no active comparator is required in the Japanese study. It's very different from the EU study. They often require that the active comparator I think that to set the price for that for the drug. And the benefit of having Japanese Asian patients in clinical trials, either phase 1, 2, or 3. I think that earlier, earlier to include that Japanese patient in your study, not necessarily in Japan. It may be, it can be done in California or wherever. If you include the Japanese patient in your study at early stage, that can facilitate obtaining alliance partner in Japan. And you can also increase the negotiation power with PMDA if you have early data with Japanese patients. And the next is the benefit of having study sites in Japan, particularly for phase 3. So that, of course, it will increase the probability of the success, approvability by PMDA. So once the drug is approved by PMDA, you can use that data as a reference to other Asian countries. So most of the Asian countries use US data or EU data or Japanese data. And because of the closer to the ethnicity, the Japanese data would be valuable to get approval from Asian countries. And of course, the benefit of commercialization in Japan, it's already mentioned that a stable and predictable price and reimbursement. So that's all my presentation, and I have my email address if you have any questions. Thank you.
I have a motion. Okay. So, our experience, my experience is mostly in developing a topical pediatric drug in Japan. And it seems like we've mostly taken the standalone study approach. And so I noticed you said it may be not required. So is it different patient populations, different routes of administration, indications? Like, what are the main factors that you think will drive PMDA to either require standalone studies or be more open to accepting alternative development pathways?
I think that our alliance partner wanted to run that study separately. I think that we have discussed a lot whether we could work together to run the multinational, US Japan study.
It's mostly driven, in our case, mostly driven by the alliance partner.
Alliance partner. Okay. Yeah, their experience, I think.
Well, excellent segue into your experiences in dealing with the Japanese marketplace.
Sure, so, I'm not gonna make a presentation, I think we talked about just sharing some of my experiences and just talking through it. Let me start with kind of where I am today, and that is because I really agree with everything that Hiro and Tomoko have said, and I might refer, I'm gonna put Melissa on in queue here to Tomoko's slide 6 here in a minute. I'm currently the CEO of Elucent. Now, Elucent is a CRO. We are considered a mid-sized CRO with about 1,200 people globally. That does not currently include Japan. But more than 80% of our business is with EPBs, so the emerging pharma bios. Those are our customers. That's who we're talking to. I saw on the list here, hello, Erica, who is, I was the CEO of Novan, which is where I worked with Tomoko and Carrie, and we did have a Japanese partner there. But let me take a step back to Tomoko's slide 6. And I'm going to use that to talk a little bit about my experience and history I shared with Hiro earlier this week. Thank you, Melissa. Because my experience actually started in 1990.
We'll just go with the other view. It'll show up, I just won't full screen it.
Okay.
Yep.
In that 1990, and it was with quintiles because it is when we were here in RTP, Boston, the UK, California, and then where next? And the where next was Japan. I was a biostatistician and project manager, and we brought some folks over from Tokyo to train them in the biostatistics. And we weren't even called a CRO then. We were a biostatistical consulting group. But we were trying to help Japanese companies get their products approved with the statistics and focus on data management. It later grew into the clinical, and it grew and grew. But that's where my experience started working with Japanese pharma companies as early as 1990. A little bit of a fast forward because in that 2010, where Tomoko has the Japanese patients are incorporated in the global study. Well, interestingly enough, with a large multinational Japanese company, we ran a 21,000 person study globally. And in this situation, in 2014, the product was approved in Japan first in September of 2014, and then approved in the US in January of 2015, so 4 months later. But it was just the regulatory process, but it was using the same data. It was a multinational trial. And so exactly, and we didn't even have this discussion, but it's exactly right that the Japanese patients were incorporated into the global study. But you saw Hiro's chart where, there's been an increase over time of products and this whole drug lag and drug loss. I completely agree. Because now fast forward to what Carrie was referring to and the different pathways. And with a multinational pharmaceutical company, they have the resources. And we keep saying resources. Resources really is funds. I mean, we say resources, and I think sometimes we think human resources, and that is part of it, but it is the dollars. It is the yen. Do we have that to run these trials? And the EPBs don't have it. I mean, I am the result of a biotech, an EPB company, not having the funds to continue development and having to divest of its assets because 2023 and now even 2024, I say 2023 was awful for raising money for EPBs. 2024 has been lumpy. That's my word for 2024. It's been lumpy. There's been some moments where we've been excited, and then there's been some dips, and 2024 has been lumpy. I'm cautiously optimistic about 2025, I'm gonna say. But in consulting the customers, like I say, where I am currently, we're not talking a lot about Japan. but I think we should be. And I think that these two presentations have just fired me up about that because, you know, I think there is that opportunity. But when you have, and I think one of the key areas is in the rare. So not too much of a sales job here, but you know, at Lucent, we have 5 centers of expertise. And it's in oncology, and it's in CNS, neurosciences. It is in general medicine. But then the 2 kind of other platform areas are cell and gene therapy. And then the 5th is rare disease, right? And so for those rare disease opportunities, you're sometimes looking for the needle in the haystack. You're looking for 150, 200, 300 patients for a clinical trial. And maybe not even that much for some of these rare diseases, but you're looking around the world for these patients. So I think it's great that the PMDA is now saying, which they have not previously said, that you don't have to do phase 1 in Japan. So if we can have, and you know, I think, you know, with folks around here, that we can have that conversation now with the PMDA on the ground in the US and have that discussion early on about, you know, currently we're going to sites in Serbia and Latvia and Georgia and US and Canada and Brazil. And we're going all over to find these rare patients to fill a clinical trial. Why not go to Japan as well? But it has not been on the radar so much because the EPBs don't have the funds to run a phase 1 in Japan. And to be able to be part of that phase or phase 2 or 3, you in the past have had to be in that phase 1. So it's not just rare. So I think my experience, again, from 1990, then 2010 to 14, running this or overseeing the running of this global, very large trial, then working in the emerging biotech area and partnering with a Japanese firm, but it has been a very traditional, and that's my word, Carrie, for it, is it's been a traditional model of a sequencing instead of parallel, right? Because in that 2010, for the companies that could afford it, you were doing it in parallel. But the companies who can't afford it are doing it sequentially. And it's getting it approved in the US and then effectively starting over in Japan for the whole process. And then you don't get the return on the investment. Who gets the return on the investment? Hopefully the Japanese people eventually get a product on the market and it can serve the patients in the country. But the lag to get there is 3, 4, 5 years. Then you have patent issues. I think we have a patent attorney here. There's a whole, you know, issue with patents as well, and when that kicks in or doesn't in Japan, relative to what you're doing in the US, et cetera. So that's a whole other, you know, can of worms that we could open up around the patent situation. So those are some of my experiences. And now, after, 1990, biostatistician, 2010, running the global trial, 2017, 18, 19 to 2020, you know, working with a Japanese pharma company, now being with a CRO who is focused on these emerging biotech companies. I think that we're in a great position, you know, to now with the PMDA coming to the US, just to start to have some different discussions and bring Japan patients into clinical trials earlier.
You know what, I will. So this is a coffee talk. And we have allocated plenty of time for your questions. We have some, we're gonna have a conversation here, but we want you to interject as well. And Melissa, you can monitor those chats. I'm just gonna pull up a chair. Let's start maybe big picture first. For companies that for companies that have maybe just thinking about Japan, How familiar, you've used phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, some of the terminology is very similar. What's different about Japan? How familiar is that process gonna be to a North Carolina company, just in general?
General. So the drug development is highly, regulated and uniform, so there's no difference between Japan and the US. So it's standard operation procedures and all dictate how to run clinical trials. So the difference is only strategy, the process is same.
Okay, so your
And I agree.
pre-IND meeting would
Right.
look the same
Mhm.
in Japan.
Right? And
They
don't
call
phase
them,
two.
in Japan, they call them consultations.
Yeah, the consultation.
You
Okay.
know, and
Uh-huh.
in the US, they're type ABC meetings. And they call
Okay.
them consultations, but they're the
Okay.
same thing.
That is familiar. So Tomoko, you had mentioned, almost sounded like Japan is, maybe a gateway to Southeast Asia or other Asian
Mhm.
markets. Talk to us a little bit about, the importance of the Japanese PMDA approval in particular.
Mhm.
Does that give you any benefits in Vietnam and Thailand?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Right, and so considering the similar ethnicity between the Japanese and even the Vietnamese from Asian countries. The data from Japanese, it can be used as a bridging for their understanding how that drug is used in that environment and how it's metabolized in their body. So the difference between Caucasians and Japanese may be a little bigger than the Japanese and the Korean or Chinese. So when I was in Japan, in addition to the participation to the global study, we initiated Asian study as well. It may not be so popular these days, but at the time around 2005, yen was much stronger than now. So the Japan was so expensive to run clinical trials. So we explored whether we can use Asian data to support the PMDA submission as well.
I have a bit of a personal interest in this
Mhm.
question.
Mhm.
So to get into maybe I'll set some context first before the question. So we have a conversation going on in Washington DC right now. You all have mentioned orphan drugs
Mhm.
and rare diseases. There's something in the United States called a priority review voucher that is a massive financial incentive for some of these smaller companies. And in fact, so a priority review voucher, just for background, is literally a piece of paper that is given to certain of these generally smaller drug companies in return for developing a medical countermeasure or a rare pediatric or a tropical disease. And that company can resell that. And the last one was $158 million for a piece of paper. And that gives the purchaser a fast track through the FDA. But all of those are sunsetting in the United States. And they're trying to figure out whether to reauthorize. Are there incentives like that in Japan?
As far as I know, that the Sakigake, I showed that in the PMDA website, that's the fast track development. So fast track, but I'm not sure about the incentives about the, like voucher in the United States has. I don't think Japan has that.
I think that priority review voucher doesn't exist. However, I just had a lunch meeting with David Ridley, who initiated this idea of priority review voucher at the Duke University. And he allowed me to mention this comment in case I get a question like this.
Okay.
I cannot be precise enough, but he said he's working on somebody in Japan on all this. Yeah. Hopefully something is coming. And
The monetary incentives for the pharmaceutical company to work on.
I don't know enough, but I assume similar incentive program, because I know that this program it also exists in European countries. So it's not surprising if same program comes to Japan.
The Japanese are talking about it. If they want to share those positive comments with Washington DC, I think that would be great for some of our companies that, again, that's a major financial incentive for some of these smaller companies to look at whether it's a medical countermeasure, whether it's a rare pediatric disease. I don't, if there are questions, Melissa, just feel free to shout them out.
Right, and for folks that are joining us virtually, feel free to just put your questions in the chat. That would be fine, or you could just raise your hand and ask the question.
Related to this, the rare orphan disease and incentives, the priority review voucher, not to go down the IP rabbit hole that Paula kind of mentioned earlier, but in the US, we have for new chemical entities, the patent term extension incentive as well. Are there any discussions on the regulatory side in Japan, not necessarily for PTE extension, but some way to compensate for the lag to incentivize companies that, if it costs you another 3 to 4 years to get it on the market in Japan? Are they considering offering any additional IP protection extensions there to?
Or I know if you look at the website of the expert committee of how to solve drug lag issues in Japan. I know one of the actions they're discussing now is to incentivize the company who made an early application for NDA. But the issue is the company in Japan make a late application compared to the US and Europe. But somehow if you apply earlier, they get incentivized. But the final conclusion hasn't been announced yet, but they announced that this is being under discussion now. So I hope something is coming.
I don't know about the patent extension type of the incentives in Japan. Seiko-san, do you know?
No, I'm not aware, but it will be very helpful. And in terms of patents, we all know it's if company EDP doesn't first file in Japan for protection, it's kind of too late to go back later once you decide to market in Japan. So I was curious if you have seen any situation where you have no IP in Japan, but decided to go into Japan anyway and was successful, or
When I was in pharmaceutical company, multinational pharmaceutical in Japan, sometimes patent life is very short. But still, as you know, Japan, many of us rely on data exclusivity, examination period, relatively longer, usually 80 years, orphan disease 10 years. And that you may last longer than even patent life. So ideally, patent life is longer than data exclusivity, but many of the cases vice versa. Patent is very short.
sounds good. And
Countries.
once you have some filing of some sort, you can kind of extend by filing some related like formulations or dosing, but whatnot to just keep going.
I think so in Japan too.
Yes, I think so. But
Right. However, I think that the bigger companies really well aware the importance of the patent, application for major regions, right? So including Japan. So I have not really encountered the companies who have no patent, submission or patent application to Japan at all. So from my experience. I think it's probably important for the emerging biopharma to protect their patent in Japan, you know, very similar time.
Yeah.
with-
No,
with
and
the-
our experience certainly was to file those very early on. Not long after the US patents were filed, but in the major countries, and Japan was one of those, was to secure that, you know, patent early on. If, you know, you had a successful product and if you went there, you would already have that filed. So I think it's, again, it costs money because you have to keep it up every year. And you have to be selective, and at times I know that we had to back off of some countries because it was just too costly. But in the major markets, and obviously with the data that Hiro shared, it's a major market. So that Japan would be your top 3 or 4, you know, to apply patents.
Hi, thank you guys. This was great. I'm Ryan Hutchinson from KBI. You mentioned before, you know, the difference between success in Japan between the established and the emerging companies, largely having to do with a presence in Japan and being able to participate in clinical trials in Japan versus not being in Japan. And I think, Paul, as you pointed out, a lot of that comes down to money, right? Where you can have your trials. However, you mentioned about the sort of ethnically diverse trial as a bridge in the middle. And I guess my question is, between having a trial in Japan and not having a trial in Japan, where does that deliberately ethnically diverse trial, where maybe you find Japanese Americans or first, second generation Japanese citizens living in the United States deliberately as part of your trial, sort of like, I guess, on that continuum, where does that fit? And is that a viable option for emerging biotech?
That's a good question. I think it's you need a negotiation with the PMDA at early stage. But if you have Asians in your, the clinical trial, that's still negotiable. And then, if come to, the Japanese market, they definitely wanted to have Japanese experience because of the social environment different, and the application of the device. Maybe you're working on the device, and the application device could be, the different. So that can be, if a PMDA approved at the stage of phase 3 completion, they still require phase 4 type of study, the experience in the Japanese patients. That's my assumption. So you need a discussion with PMDA how to, I'm not sure that I can say minimize that the study Japanese patients, but if that truly unmet medical need, then you need that treatment. I think it's good to go and to the PMDA and discuss.
I'll just add that certainly in the US, the FDA is pushing right now for more diverse clinical trials. And it's, to me, it's not for the sake of being diverse. It's the sake of representing the population that has that indication, that disease. And so the FDA is basically wanting your data to be representative. And so when you go in now with an NDA, you need to have a certain percentage. If you look at diabetes, diabetes really affects most ethnicities, some more than others, but about everybody. So you don't want to have a clinical trial of a population of just Caucasians. You need to represent the population. So I just give that as some background because there are trials that as you're collecting ethnicity data with every clinical trial, and you've got to be able to report on that. But to Tomoko's point, if you can have a conversation now with the PMDA and say that 10% of your patients in your trial were Japanese or, first generation or, Japanese, then you could potentially use that trial to go to Japan and use that part of the trial or the whole trial as a bridging study. And I have seen that, certainly done, but diversity of population in the US trials is, hugely important to the FDA now.
Thank
I
you.
also wanted to share my experience facing the situation like this. I think the point is we really wanted to clarify the regulatory pathway going forward based on the consultation with PMDA, right? So the assets originated by EBP, either originators, EBP in North Carolina, or potential buyers in Japan need to go to consultation. Otherwise, nobody knows. And I'm in the middle usually, and I'm trying to sell the assets from North Carolina EBP to Japanese companies, but we still need to clarify what are the requirements from PMDA. But reality is that nobody wants to take action. Japanese companies, potential buyers, they're usually very conservative. And then the person who is working on this project, usually business development. In order to clarify the situation based on consultation, somebody really needs to take action and paying money. Free consultation may be good, but paying money and spending hours in typical Japanese companies without getting endorsement from the senior management, nobody can take action. EBP, I think they should. However, no funding, no resource, human resource also. And then me, I don't get paid, right? If I take action, spending my team's hours, nobody pays for us. So, I'm really, getting stuck in a situation like this. That's why I think I think most likely scenario is the EBP who gains the benefit from this a lot. So that maybe spending a little time, little money, and then clarify this situation, and then go to Japanese companies. Okay, what PMDA says this, this is a written minutes. With this, you can convince your senior management. That's a better way to move this situation forward. Otherwise, this drug loss issue would continue. It's my experience.
You mentioned, I'm sorry, thank you. Diabetes, and so there are such common diseases, and there was also a discussion of rare diseases, but do you have insight into what kind of drugs, what for example, like CNS or rare diseases or what not, you see most drug loss, drug lag versus something's efficiently marketed in Japan, and from like CRO or consultant's point of view, if you have like 10 drugs in front of you that you have to, you want to market in Japan, is there any way you prioritize in terms of success in marketing in Japan?
I think that the slides show that the pediatric and then the rare diseases, those are the more than half of the drug loss for drug lag. So the PMDA focus also the those rare diseases and pediatric as well. So that's the initiative I saw from that the PMDA. So that's probably the higher priority for the PMDA. But based on this discussion, I think that any the disease area can be used this to process. The PMDA is open to re-discussion for the startups. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know one of the analysis is to see the difference by therapeutic area. But I just don't remember the outcome, but I'll let you know once the meeting is over.
Let me take your question in just a second. Just a quick follow-up, because a shout out to the EDPNC, right? You all just got an announcement the day before the new fellow is hired in Washington, DC. He's not even appointed yet, right? And you heard from him. So great program timing. Your sense, Tomoko, maybe to you, that conversation, it should get started as early as possible, but what is too early? If we have some companies that are just early stage, is that too early to contact them, or do you think the government wants to know?
Yeah, I really wanted to know myself. The ones that Dr. Ishiguro is come to be in, the Washington DC. I wanted to discuss with him because, that I'm consulting some stealth stage of the company before the Series A type of thing. So they have some plan layout that they cannot really initiate a clinical trial yet because of the funding. So how soon is too early? I don't know.
Question in the back.
I actually have a few questions. Thank you very much. Very informative. I am from the EDP world, so I fully understand and sympathize with folks who have been there. But I have been on both sides of the table when dealing with the Japanese companies, right? I mean, 18 months to do a business development deal, which should have been easier for me to just go and do a trial in Japan at that time. And it was just very extremely grueling, and so what is the best path for that? And this is of course dated information for me, my experience. Has the environment changed where the business development deals are faster? Secondly, on a different subject, is there a path that's equivalent to 505(b)(2) in Japan? And if so, is it as easy as the US, or is it a different path altogether? And a totally side remark, I've been working in the area of celiac disease, and where there's a genotype that's available. Fortunately, it's a cultural nuance that the Japanese refuse to accept that it is present in them. So it is present. They do not want to accept that they have celiac disease. So it was a very interesting challenge that we had. And the percentage of people who actually have celiac disease in Japan is 3%, which is higher than the US, which is 1%. But due to this cultural nuance, they are not ready to accept it. So so you cannot subcategorize the Asian population. If you have people in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia who have it, but that would be interesting.
Want to take the specific question first? What was the second question you had?
Business development deals for Hero, for business development versus development.
First question, right?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and do that.
Sorry,
So I have two questions: business development versus actual product development in Japan. Either out licensing to Japan or doing the development in Japan. And the second question is 505(b)(2). Is it a pathway?
Can you repeat the first question?
Is it business development partnering with a Japanese company easier nowadays? Or should one spend the time and effort and money to do their own development efforts?
Right, okay. I think theoretically, this is my opinion, in order to maximize the value of your assets, I think better to include Japan into your clinical studies like Pfizer does, either through, just by yourself or or working together with Japanese companies, for sure. But if your asset is attractive enough, even if Japanese company has to run standalone additional studies, spending a lot of money, they're still willing to buy your asset or license from you. But if the asset is not attractive enough, standalone study versus inclusion of Japan into your clinical study leads to a big difference in terms of the investment. So if in that case, if Japanese company do not come to buy your assets, I would recommend to consider starting to include Japan into your clinical studies by spending a little bit of money. But still, you can go and back to your Japanese companies and then try to get them involved and then have them pay for the portion of Japanese market, which may be like a 10% of the global universe. Then they ask that we can ask still pay them to pay 10% of your clinical studies, but still after having a partnership agreement with Japanese company. That's also another way to do.
I agree with you, just based on experience and what we talked about over the last couple of days, because when you're out licensing to the Japanese pharma company, they're taking on the product and they're starting over, right? Rather than just having them invest in what you're doing and include Japan in the trials, right? Is that another way of saying what you said? Yeah.
I think the overall business development may not be really so active, these days. The Paula said that 2023 was awful. 2 was not so bad, and 24 became bumpy. So I think it all depends on how attractive your asset is for Japanese or US the company. To get that, the license out, something. So I don't see much differences, between Japanese company and US companies, regarding that the business development activities.
Big picture though, no amount of regulatory reform is going to ever trump. You probably heard the word nemawashi, right? Which is preparing the soil before you plant the tree, right? It's not unique to Japan, right? But the Japanese take that consultative, conversational approach to a whole new level. And so, no measure of, I don't think we're ever going to see, a Japanese company do a joint venture at US speed. Right? It just doesn't happen that way because there are other factors that are equally or maybe even more important than just pouring over the spreadsheets. They're looking at the market from a more holistic standpoint.
Take a longer time. So the business development discussions, it may take more than 6 months with Japanese. It's very usual.
But the agreement will be shorter, so less lawyers, writing dozens of pages.
Yeah, I also to your first question, what I also believe is that some of the middle-sized Japanese companies also need to change in a way that they're not willing to take risks. Meaning that they often we don't have enough experiences running a multinational clinical studies, and our clinical people are not experienced, etc., etc. So they tend to go for like a standalone clinical studies, which cost a lot of money. But in order to, when they assess the opportunities, assuming standalone clinical studies, paying X million for upfront payment like this, and then they give up. And then they're facing a situation where pipelines are running out. It's really out. No more pipelines in those companies. So they also need to change to improve their financial situation. So I think that now the PMDA is offering a lot of good things for EBP in the US. I think if Japanese companies also now is a time for them to change as well. This is also going to lead to solving drug loss. So like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be like a win-win-win situation. Everybody will be happy to take extra steps, both US and Japan.
Related to that, so I know most of the companies on the Zoom here are always chasing capital, right? And I thought what you said about Japanese partners cost sharing with the Japanese market share. Is there any opportunity for a North Carolina company to tap into some of the capital that exists in Japan? Should anybody be looking to Japan to fundraise in general? I mean, does that happen yet?
Japanese startups, really and then need the capital, and the funding. So the reason, and I'm supporting Japanese university spin-off, that they wanted to come to the US, obviously, because the money is here in the US. But, I always do some due diligence of their data, but if the data is good, I recommend them to start the phase 1 clinical trials here in the US. I know partnering that they are the Japanese company, they will do such as that. So they can plan for their so to initiate the clinical trials or to come to the US, they don't have much money.
Your point is that when North Carolina companies run the multinational studies, including Japan, asking whether like a venture capital company in Japan willing to pay for that. Right? I think that's a very interesting idea, and I wanted to ask.
I actually have a question related to you. So coming from the investor's background, the question spinning around my head is that what stage of development is the right stage of investment to basically like most effectively and efficiently bring those assets into Japan market? And we covered like lots of perspectives about like regulatory changes and like a BD, probably that's also one perspective. But obviously, like from the EVP side, it's pretty clear that the more money, the better, and the earlier, the better. But on the other side, from the investor's perspective, the question is always that the efficiency and the outcome, the performance return. So we tend to prefer to have the investment at the later as possible. So taking all these, putting in the one box, like what is the right balance? What is that, like a phase 2 or like pretty much? I just really interested to hear your opinions, and everybody's in the floor. So
I think different companies or different investors have different strategies. I'm sure you do, and some are we like to get in early and get out early, or we like to get in late and stay through commercialization. So I think it's strategic, but for me, just the conversation we've been having is, I don't think that Japan is going to be involved if it's a emerging MVP until they may not get involved if they don't get involved at phase 1. So to me, as soon as that sort of proof of concept, end of phase 1, that's when you also then want to get in Japan at that earlier stage, rather than waiting until you're in phase 3 and then trying to involve Japan. I think that's what you've been saying, is trying to get involved earlier. So it seems to me the investment time is probably at the end of phase 1. That's my opinion.
I agree. I agree with you. But I also see the gap in the timing of the best timing of companies in Japan and US investing, meaning that for US companies, EVP, they need to think in investing a little more money for Japan before phase 2, as Paula mentioned. But Japanese company usually wanted to wait until POC is done. Right? So somebody really needs to fill the gap. And I hope EVP here can fill the gap, spending a little more money. But as David mentioned, if the investors, like a product financing, if investor supports that portion of extra Japan development funding, which is not a huge money anyway, but if developer investors willing to pay for this, and then once Japanese partner buy the assets, investor gets return from that investment. You know, that kind of model may also be option.
Well, and it sounds, I'm encouraged by the pricing conversations that the PMDA is willing to engage in those consultations earlier in the process, right? Because that, if you're out raising money, right, you want to value your company looking at future sales, and that gives you an opportunity to put a value on your pro forma, right? So I'm encouraged by that as well, being able to talk price early in the process. And there was a second question.
Yeah.
and I've forgotten it by now.
B2.
Okay, there you go.
505(b)(2).
Right. Yeah.
Similar pathway in Japan?
Yeah, as far as I understand, there's no like a pathway like this in Japan. Yeah, I'm also hoping that Japan is going to introduce 505(b)(2) pathway. However, as I haven't heard anything about this, probably lower priority. I hear a lot about drug loss issues and orphan disease, etc., but not 505(b)(2). Yes.
So most questions here are about clinical trials and things like that, and I own a CDMO, a manufacturing side of things. Right, here we have like FDA inspection and approval of the site, and EU, we have approvals, EU approved facilities. Similarly, when the innovative companies are looking to make the product that goes into the clinical trials, as a CDMO company, how do I get my site qualified to manufacture for the Japan market? For clinical trials or for commercial product?
PMDA have also the audit and inspection, like FDA.
Okay.
But you know, it's not today's discussion, but it could be that a good discussion you can have with the PMDA.
Okay.
Well, so the FDA and PMDA will discuss how they can integrate. It may not be necessary to have duplicated.
That's what I'm hearing. I've worked with submitting to the PMDA before when I was in Banner Life Sciences, working with GSK, submitting to the PMDA, soft gel capsules. But the inspection that happened was like most like a post-approval inspection and not like a general GMP inspection to approve the facility itself to like the FDA does here. So we did have the pre-approval inspection, but not a general GMP's inspection. So is there something like that exists?
I'm sorry, I don't know exactly.
Very much.
I can speak a little bit to it. So I'm also on the CMC side, on the innovator considerations. But you know, when we've done CDMO evaluations to select a site, I mean, because we had and have a Japanese alliance partner, that has certainly been a conversation that we've had in the very early outreaches of vendor selection, because not all of the vendors are qualified or comfortable supporting the JP compliance. And so it is different. It's not exactly the same as the FDA compliance from a manufacturing perspective. I'm not super versed on what the differences are and how, you know, I can't go to that level of detail, but I know from our program experience that not all manufacturers are JP compliant, and our partner considerations have to be brought in very early on. And so I don't know if there have to be consultants that you could reach out to what specifically the differences are that you need to be prepared. I am anecdotally aware there's a lot of paper audits. Paper audits initially, that's very common, especially post-COVID, the in-person audits of the travel, and there are some also vendors that have shared that the PMDA has been open to reciprocity. So if you are inspected by the FDA, and that, again, depending on the indication, the population, they may be willing to accept some of that. But a lot of paper audits, but there are differences that need to be considered from a manufacturing perspective.
From a manufacturing perspective, and sampling and testing and all that is different as well, which we have done in the past. But I'm no longer with that company. I've started my own company and I'm trying to see how to get this company, because with this and if that number of submissions going up and things like that, that's one side. But then there has to be more people manufacturing and be able to at least manufacture for those clinical studies, right? That's the other piece of the puzzle. And we need to look at both in parallel, not one or the other. Because yes, the number of applications or approvals might go up, but then there should be enough people to even manufacture for those clinical studies. And that's where I am coming from.
And testing as well. Like
And testing as
complementary to
well,
the
you know,
manufacturing,
and
but I
I
know,
yeah.
we spend a lot of time talking about testing differences and, like the
Sampling
US, you can
data.
leverage stability data, but in Japan, they want to actually test samples that come back from the field after a clinical trial, for example. That's one difference that we've personally experienced. So
Yeah,
I don't know if it's alliance partner driven or PMDA driven, but I can just, from my personal experience, that's been, one example of it.
That's my experience too, and that's where I wanted to see, okay, how do we bring that other piece of the puzzle to the table?
Maybe just somewhat related to that, yesterday I was at a defense supply chain, industrial supply chain conference in Charlotte. And the politicians following COVID, reshoring was the buzzword, right? And I think everyone thought it would be easy, and it's not. So for vaccines and needles and syringes and medical devices, the kinds of things we might stockpile in the United States or provide, or that the Department of Defense would purchase. They were announcing, of course, that, we now consider our reshored supply chain to include Australia and Canada. Japan is not on that list yet for the Department of Defense, but those conversations are ongoing, and I'm sure that will happen in the near term. The fact that Japan will shortly, I hope and trust, be part of that network, right? We're talking about drugs for pediatric diseases, right? But there's a whole category of pharmaceutical sales to stockpiles and whatnot. And I think the opportunity will be terrific for companies that have invested in, certainly it's already good for all the Australians with blood products and for, the Canadians, but I think there'll be a real opportunity for folks in the manufacturing space, right? Either in Japan or here that are, part of that ecosystem. They spent a lot of time talking about, bemoaning the fact that all the vaccines are produced in China. That hasn't changed much.
They also encourage to have the CDMO inside of Japan, because during the COVID time, they had really painful experience that they could not really, develop their drug in Japan.
Yes.
Thank you.
We have a question, virtual, and we're running short on time. I have a medical device question. So in regards to the market in Japan, how does regulatory approval for a pharmaceutical versus a medical device look different? And what are the unique challenges to be expected in terms of medical device approvals and post-market surveillance? And just heads up to everyone that we're almost on the hour. I think that if we're able to stay and, answer this question and maybe another couple of questions, I welcome people to stay on, but I want to be respectful that it is almost 12 o'clock. So I just want to acknowledge that if you need to leave or drop the call, that is fine. And I'll let the panel decide at what point you need to wrap up as well. But any comments on medical device versus pharmaceutical?
I don't have my direct experience with the device, but the process itself is very similar with drug.
But I know, some of my customers, clients, have a medical device, thinking to come to Japan market. And I'm also not an expert of medical device, but my impression is the regulatory requirement is less than the one of pharmaceutical companies. My client said, our assumption is that we don't need additional clinical studies for that asset for Japan. Of course, it may, I read the precise articles, but I just don't remember. But regarding a post-marketing surveillance,
we'll do a program on that.
Yeah, we can do a program on that.
Cosmeceuticals, well, there's a whole lot of opportunities in Japan. Anything else virtually?
I think
If
maybe
not,
someone else in the room had a question.
we take one more. If not, again, thank you to EDPNC for prioritizing this program. I think it was incredibly timely. I wanna, I'm so grateful that you all took time out of your busy schedules to join us here. Let's have a conversation, though. These slides are gonna be available, correct, to the participants?
We can make them, and if there's anything that you wanna adjust,
Yeah.
I'll get with the panel and we'll
Okay,
send those
so
out.
those QR codes,
everyone
those email
that
addresses.
Get registered, yeah, and then we'll have this is being recorded. It goes on EDPNC's YouTube channel. So we have export coffee talks, I wanna say at least 10 times probably a year. And they're on a variety of topics. Some of them have been life science specific. Many of them are cross industry, but they're related to exporting. It could be business culture tips from one of our foreign offices. It could be about other offerings that we have, or bringing in our ecosystem partners from the US Commercial Service or the Small Business Technology and Development Center's International Business Counselors. So we also take recommendations for ideas. So please let us know. And the EDPNC's website has all of our events listed on it. And it literally is edpnc.com. You could go to events. So thank you very much for your expertise, for your time. And I personally, being the trade manager that covers life sciences, will be recommending this panel to the companies that I meet in the future, and repeat meetings that I have with those. I already know. So thank you very much.
We're gonna stick around for a few minutes. We're gonna complain about why you can't get Tylenol in Tokyo.
I'll go ahead.
NyQuil, I guess. NyQuil is the big one. Anyhow, but join me in a round of applause for our